Hello, welcome back. I wanted to show you guys a quick technique of how you would go about procedurally modeling and texturing and creating a sequins pillow, because why not? So let's get started. First, I would drop down a good scale reference just to kind of see how big your pillow is. I always just kind of try and drop one of these down, but we can create a new geometry node here, and I'll just call it create pillow. So right off the bat, let me just ghost other objects so I can still kind of see him in the scene. Right off the bat, I'm going to drop down a box, just a simple box. I'm going to change the size to 0.5, maybe 0.01 here, and 0.5 as well. There we go. That looks about the size of a pillow that could fit in his arms. And next, what I want to do is essentially bump up these divisions here on the geometry itself. So we're going to bump this up to 12, and we'll bump this up to 3 and 12. If I hold down Shift W here in the viewport, we can kind of see how the geometry is looking. Next, what I want to do essentially to create the shape of this pillow is actually a pretty easy method. We're going to use a simulation to do that. So I'm going to type in vellum configure balloon, and this is super simple. If you've never even simulated anything, don't worry. We're just going to connect this here, and in the vellum pressure, what we want to do is jump this rest length scale to about say 40. Drop down a vellum solver, plug in these first two inputs. I'm gonna bring this back to 1, and in your forces, just change your gravity to 0. So we have no gravity, and once this starts to simulate, it's gonna go pop from the pressure, and we're just gonna find a good frame to kind of put this at. And so let's say frame 40 is good. So then what I can do is just time shift this to frame 40, going to right click and delete channels. So essentially we've just frozen the frame here. How I aligned those is I selected all of these, held down A, and then dragged, so it kind of aligns your nodes. Pretty nifty. And what I'm going to do is drop down to transform just to put this in the good spot. So I'm going to move to centroid, click here. Maybe I'll just rotate this kind of like so. Okay, so it's in the spot I want. So now we can say base pillow, just for organization's sake. What I'm also going to do is, now that we have this low res version, I'm going to just drop down a subdivide node, and we're just going to subdivide this a couple times so we get a nice round pillow shape. Great. Now this won't be exactly like the one in the video that I made because I'm just redoing the process, but it's the same setup essentially. So what we can do now is we want to essentially grab a tube, maybe change the height to 0.1. With this object, we'll put down end caps. This is going to basically be the basis for our sequin. That we want to do is just essentially scatter points all across the pillow and then copy this geometry to there. So I'm going to drop down a normals node, and what this does is it calculates the normals. I'm going to change it to points. So now we have these point normals all across the geometry. I'm going to toggle that off. What I can do here is essentially scatter a bunch of points on our mesh. Real quick, actually what I want to do, if you middle mouse click here, we see we have all of these attributes from the vellum simulation. What I'm going to do is drop down a clean here before and just toggle these off, but I'm going to remove all the attributes so we have a nice clean base pillow mesh. So yeah, so when we drop down this normal node here, it creates normals on our points, which are going to be useful for scattering the tube geometry. One other thing that I'm going to do is if I copy to points here, we see that once we copy these tubes, they are all massive tubes because we haven't changed the actual scale, because the scale of this tube is pretty big. So what we can do is drop down an attribute float adjust node, and it's already kind of defaulted set to, I'm going to just change this to set initial to p scale, and our constant value will, let's say for now, 0.01. So now we see that we are copying these on that, and they kind of look like sequins on a pillow. However, they're not oriented correctly. So a few things to understand here. This tube geometry, it's facing in the y-axis. What we want to do is actually face it in the z-axis, because anything in Houdini, when it is copied onto like a normal attribute, for example, here with our points, this normal, whatever direction it's pointing, imagine that's the same orientation as the z-axis. So now when we copy here, let me toggle that off, we see that these sequins are oriented exactly how the normals here were pointing. And that's because it's facing down the z-axis here. I'm also going to drop down a match size and actually push this. If I justify z to the min, I'm going to push this so now when it copies onto the point, it won't copy in the center like so here, but it'll actually copy flush as if this was on the pillow. So we can go down and check that. If we toggle that off, we see that it pushes it out just a bit. One other thing I'm going to do is drop down a peak node. And all this peak node does, we're going to uncheck recalculate point normals. If I turn on my normals, we can just basically peak the points out along the normal. So if you see, it just moves along the same direction of the normal. And I'm just going to peak it very, very small along the normal there, but that's just so then the sequins can kind of rest on top of the pillow. So next step, we need to up the amount of scatter of sequins that we're going to put on this pillow. I'm going to, we've got a good amount here, but we see that we get some unevenness in the scatter, and that's because we need to relax the iterations on the scatter node. So I'm going to bump that up to 100 here, and that's looking a lot better. What I can also do is maybe double the amount of sequins. Now we see we have too many. However, I'm just going to change our p scale to 0.005. Maybe 0.006, maybe 0.007. Yeah, that's looking about the amount of like sequence size I would want. And again, we see we have some areas that we're not getting clear distribution, so maybe bump those iterations up to about 300. That helps, and maybe add about 5,000 sequins just to kind of even things out. Maybe that's too many. Again, it's just kind of up to your discretion. Okay, so now we have our sequins copied on here. And what we now can do is essentially add some sort of texture. Just as most sequin pillows you get are kind of these goofy textures that go on top of it. I'm going to take from our original box here. I'm going to Alt click and drag and duplicate this so it has the same point count as the subdivided pillow. If we middle mouse click here, 2,000, about 20,000 points, 20,000 points. Okay, so we know it's the same mesh, and that'll be handy in just a sec. So I'm going to UV project on this mesh before it's subdivided. I'm going to go to this initialize tab. We can toggle on our UVs, and we see that it's UV mapped this correctly. Okay, so it'll subdivide, and now I'm going to go to attribute from map. If you watched my brick tutorial, you'll see some similar concepts here. I'm going to actually use a standard base picture that kind of comes with Houdini, and it's called the mandrel. I can toggle these UV squares, so now we get this color of this mandrel. And what I can do is, now that I've projected kind of that image, and you could use whatever image you want, I'm going to drop down a point wrangle, okay? And before the scatter node, right here, if I plug in this third input, I'm just gonna say, hey, at color, you are equal to this point third input because Houdini reads these inputs as 0, 1, 2, 3. We want to get the CD, which is the color attribute, a standard attribute in Houdini, and we want to get it for every single point number. So now we've successfully transferred that color, and the great thing about the scatter node is when it scatters, it automatically copies that color there. So we have color on the points, and then again when we copy to these points, the sequins inherit that same color. So we get kind of like this colored sequin. Picture's upside down. We could obviously rotate the pillow, or we could just rotate it here in our image by 180. That'll update there procedurally. Okay. Lastly, what I want to do is I just kind of want to orient these sequins kind of offset. Right now they're just flush with the pillow, but if I kind of offset them, then I think that'll give us more of a sequin look. So what I can do is just drop down a polyframe node and plug it in before the scatter. And what this is going to do is calculate a tangent, a normal that is tangent to the normal. So I'm going to uncheck normal because we already calculated our normal. I'm going to name this up. And just to show you what's going on here, if I click the eye and click up, we see that we have these orthogonal vectors, meaning they are perpendicular to the normal vector. And that is useful because then we can create some sort of an orientation on our points. So I'll kind of show you with that orientation, we have our normals and our visualize here. What I'm going to do is jump in here, change the length here, and I also can hit D in my scene and change these normals to that size. So basically what we want to do is these points are sticking outwards, or they have a normal that's sticking outwards, and then they have a perpendicular vector called the up vector that we're basically going to want to rotate around that up vector axis. So if I drop down a point VOP, I can plug it in here before the copy, and I'm going to drop down a bind, meaning I'm going to import my up vector attribute. So I'm going to change it to a vector, and I'm going to drop down a quaternion node. Long story short, basically this helps with some 3D rotations. I'm not going to go too much into what a quaternion is, but I'm going to drop down a parameter and call this rotate. So basically from here we're going to control this rotation, and we want to control it in degrees. However, the angle in which quaternion takes is radians. So I'm going to drop down a degrees to radians node and plug in whatever rotation input we put in as a degree. It's going to convert that to a radian. Plug it in here. And then the axis about which we want to rotate is that up vector. So now we've created a quaternion, and we're going to convert this quaternion to a matrix 3, which is essentially a 3D rotation matrix. And the great thing about that is we can just multiply our normals by this matrix, and it will do the math of rotating. So now if I plug this into our normal at the end, we see nothing's happened because we haven't rotated anything. But as we look at, say, this point right here, if I middle mouse click here and start to rotate, we see, oh, I have to toggle the display on here. We see that it starts to rotate these normals about that axis. So great thing about that is now that will update for our sequins geometry here. So if I start to rotate, then we see that we have these sequins that are kind of offset off the pillow a bit here. So it kind of creates more of that sequin look. Okay, so I will then merge these sequins in with my base pillow mesh. And you could then assign a material to each of these. And I'm just going to create a matte net right here. Dive inside here, and I'm going to just drop down a principal shader Alt click to duplicate it, drop down pillow, and maybe call this one Sequin. Okay, I'm gonna save a quick mark. So if I in here hold down Control 2, I'm gonna jump out by pressing U here. So then I can just kind of hit the number 2 on my keyboard and go back to that really quick. But here in this material, I'm going to back double dots. And what these do is basically it looks at, when I go back 1, it's kind of like a directory structure in Linux. So I'm going to look at all the nodes here. So now it will give us access to this material net. And now it dives inside there, and I'm going to select Sequin. I'm going to Control C, copy that, Control V, paste here. But now I'm going to write pillow. Okay. And we can now just render this. So I'm going to jump out here. We've created this pillow. We have this Tommy. I'm going to drop down another geometry, render pillow. I always like to do this just for cleanliness sake, just to object merge here what we've created. Create 2 directories out, create pillow out. If we middle mouse click here, they have their materials and their color attribute on there. So now if I hit space G, we can kind of zoom out here. If I select just this pillow and hit space G here, kind of have a nice center around this. I can come up here, hold down Control and click camera. So now we have a camera. And let's hurry and do a quick little render setup. I'm not going to go into the full details of how I did mine, but this is just to get you going so then you can kind of finish it up on your own. So I'm going to jump over to the out context and drop down a mantra ROP. And over here in the objects to render, I'm going to get rid of that candidate and just type in render star, which means, well, let's drop down a quick mark here, Control 3 for the out. Go back here, Control 1 here. So now we have our quick marks, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so this render star basically will look at any objects here and it's going to render anything that's tagged render and beyond. So if it starts with render, it's going to render it. Last thing we need is a light. So I'll just drop down a quick environment light just to show that the render is going. And now we should be good to render. So let me hop over to my render view. That was my old one. We're going to use this camera. And we have our mantra view, and I'm going to hit render. This will take just a sec to boot up. Okay, and now we see that we're getting a fully balanced lighting setup from our environment light. So I'm going to pause this, jump back out here, maybe come over here and hold down Control and hit an area light just to kind of get more of a rim light there. Jump back, and we see we are getting these rendered sequins and this pillow. And if I hit 2 to jump back to our material, I think the pillow material is fine if it's kind of like this default gray. But with the sequins, we actually want to do is kind of drop the roughness down to like 0.01 because these are kind of like shiny, reflective. And then maybe even up the metallic to about 0.5. So it's kind of like this reflective kind of metallic material. You notice from my example, I did finesse it quite a bit as far as putting lighting where it needs to go. You'll see maybe you get these little divots where it's like a little bit more black. So what you could do is make the thickness on your sequins a little bit more. And then also what you could experiment with, which I've shown in other tutorials before, is always go for trying to vary up different things, whether that's the position or the normals on these things. So one real quick tip, what we could do is I'll drop down a normals for the standard pillow, but then also I'll drop down the a normals here for these sequins. And what we could do is we could drop down an attribute noise vector, and we can call this normal and have it operate on the vertex. So it's going to basically add some noise to these to the normal on these sequins. And so basically we can see by changing the element size, we can see it starts to add a little bit of noise and variation to our normals, which is kind of how things are going to appear in real life. Nothing's like totally smooth. And so by doing that, adding up some extra variation, when we go back to the render view, for example, we see that now it kind of creates this more interesting pattern. Now that's quite a bit. Maybe we jump the amplitude down to 0.1. Kind of, it's going to take a little bit of like trial and error to see exactly what you like. Maybe that's too frequent, so maybe we change the element size to 0.14, kind of spruce it up there. Maybe the amplitude's still too high. We can kind of vary things a bit. Mine, I did spend a good amount of time kind of tweaking the lighting, tweaking some of these settings on the normals just to make it feel like sequins that were kind of offset and imperfect. And that's the setup that I did. So obviously, if you want to take it to the next level, there are some fine tunings that you could do, but this is definitely enough to get you started on how you'd kind of create something totally inside Houdini this way. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, do that whole thing, just because it kind of helps things out. So anyway, we'll see you guys later. Take care.